Okay, in this mini tutorial, we're going to look at the problem of quadrantanopias. Now, I strongly recommend that before you watch this video, you make sure that you've really understood the basics of the visual pathway, bitemporal hemianopia and homonymous hemianopia. Because this is the highest level that we're going to get to, really, is getting you to understand quadrantanopias. And the approach that we're going to take is the same approach that we took in trying to understand homonymous hemianopia. So let's just remind you what we did. We considered the right and left halves of the visual field. So we said that this was the left half and that this was the right half. And we said that we're going to look at the parts of the retina which look at the right visual field. So that would be the temporal retina of the left eye and the nasal retina of the right eye. So you'll recall that, they're doing this kind of thing. And the parts of the retina looking at the left visual field would be the temporal retina of the right eye and the nasal retina of the left eye, looking at this part of the visual field. Okay. But what we're actually going to do is we're not going to split the visual field up into two halves. We're actually going to split it up into 4 quarters. Okay. But we're going to retain our colour scheme. However, we're going to use light and dark red and blue instead of just plain red or blue. Okay. So for the top right hand quarter of the visual field, we're going to use this dark blue. Okay, so for the top right hand quarter of the visual field, we're going to use dark blue. For the bottom right hand corner of the visual field, we're going to use light blue. Okay, so there's light blue in the bottom right hand corner. For the top left hand corner of the visual field, we're going to use dark red, like this. And for the bottom left hand quarter of the visual field, we're going to use light red, like this. And the reason we're doing this is because different populations of neurons subserve different quarters of the visual field. However, they still follow the same rules in terms of crossing over, whether they're top half or bottom half, but we'll come to that later on. So, bearing this in mind, let's draw out the visual pathway. Okay, so here is the left eye, and here is the right eye. Okay, here are the optic nerves, here is the chiasm, and here are the optic tracts, and here are the lateral geniculates. Okay. But we need to add a few extra bits on. So this was the version that we had originally, but we need to add a couple of extra structures on in order to fully understand quadrantanopias. First of all, we need to remind ourselves that the optic radiations are actually organised into 2 separate populations of axons. Okay, so let's just draw on a point here and a point here, where the 2 separate populations of axons in the optic radiations originate from. Okay, so we'll draw on the visual cortex like this. Okay, we'll draw on the first part of the optic radiation, which goes through the parietal lobes directly to the visual cortices. Okay, so this is a large bulk of the optic radiation passing through the parietal lobes directly to the visual cortices. A second part is it loops around in the temporal lobe. Okay, it loops around in the temporal lobe on its way to the visual cortex, and this part of the optic radiations is called Meyer's loop. Okay, so Meyer's loop loops through the temporal lobe on its way to the visual cortex. And Meyer's loop is important because if you have, say, a big stroke affecting the temporal lobe, you can destroy the axons in Meyer's loop, giving a specific visual field defect. And that's what we're going to consider now. As we did in the scene, when we coloured it in the different shades of blue and red, we're going to split up the retinae into different portions. Okay, so we're going to do the original split into nasal and temporal halves. But what we're also going to do is we're going to split them into superior and inferior halves. Okay, so now we've got each retina has both a nasal and a temporal half, and a superior and an inferior half. And this brings us on to a really important point. And it relates to this fact that the eye is a pinhole camera. So you should be well familiar with the idea, for example, that if we consider the right eye, the right half of the visual field, i.e. the temporal half of the visual field, goes in and is seen by the nasal half of the retina. Whereas for the right eye, the nasal half of the visual field is seen by the temporal half of the retina. And it's all down to this pinhole camera, which inverts the way that we see things. This doesn't just apply to left and right, it also applies to up and down as well. Okay? And what that means is that the superior half of the visual field is seen by a corresponding inferior half of the retina. Okay? So the superior half of a visual field is seen by the corresponding inferior half of the retina. And when I say corresponding, I don't mean that this, say, top right quadrant of the visual field is seen by the part of the retina immediately below. It actually goes on a diagonal. And we're going to draw this out and make it clearer a bit later on. But it's a direct geometric consequence of the pinhole camera arrangement that we have in the eye. So let's draw on the parts of the retina which supply the different parts of the visual field. Okay, so let's change our colour to dark red. Okay, so dark red is the area supplying the top left hand corner of the visual field. Okay, and if we think about it, because of the pinhole camera effect, therefore this dark red part of the visual field must be subserved by the opposite part of the retina. Okay, so this top left-hand portion of the visual field is seen by the inferior part of the nasal retina in the left eye and the inferior part of the temporal retina in the right eye. Okay, now let's consider the bottom left half of the visual field, which is here. Now the bottom left half of the visual field must be seen by the top right half of the retina. Okay, so here in light red, we're drawing on the neurons that see the bottom left portion of the visual field. Okay, so the bottom left quadrant of our visual field is seen by the superior half of the nasal retina in the left eye and the superior half of the temporal retina in the right eye. Now, for the right half of the visual field, let's consider the parts of the retina which see the top right quadrant of the visual field. Well, the parts of the retina which see the top right quadrant of the visual field would therefore be the bottom left part of this retina in the left eye and the bottom left part of the retina in the right eye. So to recap that, the top right quadrant of the visual field is seen by the lower half of the temporal retina in the left eye and the lower half of the nasal retina in the right eye. Finally, considering the bottom right quadrant of the visual field, we'll change to light blue. and the bottom right quadrant of the visual field must be seen by these remaining quadrants of the retinae. Okay. So you can see that the bottom right quadrant of the visual field is seen by the superior half of the nasal retina of the right eye and the superior half of the temporal retina in the left eye. So if you look at the retinae that we've drawn out and compare it with the image that we provided, there's a simple direct sort of diagonal transposition which gives us the part of the retina that sees the corresponding quadrant of the visual field. Now let's try to put this together and draw on the visual pathways. Now, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, if I were to do this for both eyes, each with 4 quadrants to the retina, the diagram would become very, very messy and cluttered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus just on the left eye, okay? So I'm going to focus just on the left eye and draw on the pathways from the different quadrants of that left retina, all right? So let's start off by using our dark blue to consider the neurons, the retinal ganglion cells, which arise from the lower half of the temporal retina in the left eye. Okay, so here in dark blue, here's the axon of that neuron. It goes into the lateral geniculate and it synapses on a neuron here in the lateral geniculate. And these neurons from the lower half of the retina, they synapse on neurons in the lateral geniculate which send their axons through Meyer's loop in the temporal lobe. Okay? So Meyer's loop contains information from the lower half of the retina. Okay? Let's stay on the on the temporal retina and switch to light blue. Okay? So here in light blue, we're going to draw our axon here, originating from a ganglion cell from the superior half of the temporal retina. It synapses in the lateral geniculate, and then this lateral geniculate neuron projects to the visual cortex through the part of the optic radiation which runs through the parietal lobes. Okay? So to recap this, information from the lower half of the retina goes to the LGN, where the second neuron projects through Meyer's loop in the temporal lobe to get to the visual cortex, whereas information from the superior half of the retina projects to the LGN, but the neuron in the LGN goes directly to the visual cortex through the optic radiations in the parietal lobe. Now let's look at the red neurons. So we'll switch to dark red to represent this neuron from the inferior half of the nasal retina. Remember that crosses at the chiasm. Okay, and because it's from the inferior half of the retina, when it synapses, the second neuron in the LGN sends its axon through Meyer's loop and thence ultimately to the visual cortex. Switching to light red to consider the neuron in the superior half of the nasal retina in the left eye. It sends its axon down here. Once again, crosses at the chiasm because it's a nasal neuron. Synapses in the LGN on the contralateral side, but this neuron then projects through the parietal lobe to get to the visual cortex. Once again, to recap, here is our neuron in the nasal half of the retina, but sitting in the inferior quadrant. Because it's inferior, once it's projected across the chiasm, it synapses, and then the second neuron from the LGN projects through Meyer's loop. Whereas the neuron sitting in the superior half of the nasal retina from the left eye crosses, synapses in the LGN, but then projects through the optic radiations in the parietal lobe to get to the visual cortex. Now, this is where things start to get really quite interesting. We've already considered the effects of a lesion in the optic tract or a complete lesion of the lateral geniculate. So that's homonymous hemianopia. But what we're going to consider in this video is what's the effect of a lesion here in Meyer's loop, or a lesion here in the part of the optic radiation running through the parietal lobe. So let's put on a lesion here in Meyer's loop sitting on the right hand side. Okay, so this is the right hand side. We've got the lesion, it might be a big stroke for example, and it's affected Meyer's loop on that right hand side. Now let's look at the colour of neuron which has been affected. We can see that it's the dark red neuron that has been affected. The dark red pathway to the visual cortex has been interrupted by this lesion in Meyer's loop. And so therefore we have lost the dark red region of the visual field. Okay? We've lost the dark red region of the visual field. So the green lesion leads to loss of the top left quadrant of the visual field. I just want to remind you at this point, of course, that we're only considering the left eye here in isolation. Of course, the same defect would affect the right eye, but we haven't got the space to draw out the pathways for the right eye. So we're only considering the left eye here in isolation. Now let's consider a lesion here in the part of the optic radiations running through the parietal lobe. And we'll use purple to represent that. This is actually a rarer lesion than the lesion affecting Meyer's loop, but it's got a useful importance for us to explain. So you'll note that the purple lesion has destroyed the light red pathway, okay? And the light red pathway is the lower left quadrant of the visual field here. So this is the region we would lose if we had a purple lesion, all right? Likewise, if we had a lesion over here at this point, this is the light blue pathway, we would of course lose this quadrant of the visual field. And if we had a lesion here, the dark blue pathway, we would lose the right upper quadrant of the visual field. Once again, only if we consider the left eye on its own. But if I did draw on all the pathways, it would affect both eyes. So this is a really difficult aspect of neuroanatomy. And I think if you take the time to think about this and to draw out the pathways yourself, you'll get it too. But you need to really take some time to understand this because it's not easy. And it's about the hardest thing we can ask you when it comes to visual fields. Okay, thanks a lot.